High on a hill overlooking the Hudson River is a place that invites you to take a step back in time, to the Middle Ages. It is a place unique in this country and perhaps even the world. It is evocative of monasteries and churches. It is a museum called the Cloisters. I'm Philippe de Montebello, Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is my pleasure to escort you through the Cloisters, the branch museum of the Metropolitan that is devoted to art created during the Middle Ages. Here at the Cloisters, one can see art of the sacred and the profane, ranging from the Romanesque style, massive and strong, to the Gothic style, elegant, light, graceful, all under one roof. The Cloisters is not a copy of any particular medieval building, but it's an ensemble of spaces and gardens that suggests, rather than duplicates, the European models. Here in the museum, original fragments of medieval structures are integrated into a 20th century building to evoke the atmosphere of the Middle Ages. The nucleus of the present collection was formed by the American sculptor George Gray Barnard. In the early years of this century, Barnard amassed sculpture and architectural elements created during the Middle Ages, that is, between the 5th and the early 16th centuries. Often he bought these pieces in the countryside of southern France from pragmatic farmers who had used them as scarecrows or grape arbors. The farmers had salvaged the works of art from the ruins of medieval monasteries that were damaged or destroyed during the Protestant uprisings in the 16th century or later during the French Revolution. Barnard recognized the artistic worth of what he called old stones. He kept a great many, sold many more, and thus financed his own sculpture projects. When he returned to New York on the eve of the First World War, Barnard founded a museum in northern Manhattan on Fort Washington Avenue. His intention was to instruct young American sculptors in the art of what he called the patient Gothic chisel. The Metropolitan Museum purchased most of Barnard's collection in 1925 with funds given by John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Built atop a rocky wooded point, the setting of the new Cloisters is reminiscent of many medieval monasteries and castles. Not only was the land around the site preserved, but so was the view from the museum. Rockefeller purchased a strip of over 700 acres of the undeveloped Palisades woodlands across the Hudson River and presented it to the state of New Jersey as parkland. The museum is organized around the idea of the medieval cloister, hence the museum's name. A cloister is a covered walkway surrounding a large open courtyard. It was the heart of a medieval monastery. It functioned both as a passageway and processional walkway, much as the museum's cloisters act as passages to galleries and as spaces of quiet repose. The cloister is both secluded and private, yet is open to air, light, and greenery. The warm beauty of the pink marble unifies the cloister's varied capitals. The medieval cloister was a place of meditation and, because of the abundance of natural light, an ideal location for reading the scriptures. But cloisters were not always the serene places we imagine. While reading, monks were expected to repeat each word quietly but audibly. A buzz of devotional recitation would have permeated the cloister at certain times of day. This Romanesque cloister from the monastery of Saint-Michel de Cuxat was located in the Pyrenees in France and built during the 12th century. Before it was damaged and scattered, the cloister at Cuxat once measured some 150 by 130 feet, approximately twice the size it is today. In keeping with the plan of a traditional monastery, the church is located just off the central cloister. Here is the 12th century apse from a church in the village of Fuentidueña, north of Madrid. The rounded apse is constructed of nearly 3,000 massive blocks of ochre-toned limestone, numbered, carefully taken apart on the site, crated, and then reassembled at the cloisters. The entire process spanned 4 years, from 1957 to 1961. The graceful arch and semicircular barrel vault are crowned by a half dome. The considerable weight of this ceiling is supported by thick, massive walls following an architectural system of Roman origin. The style is now referred to as Romanesque. The great expanse of wall space in Romanesque churches was often decorated with fresco paintings, such as this representation of the Virgin and Child enthroned in majesty, originally from a church in the Catalonian Pyrenees. The fresco shows the Virgin as the Mother of God, severe, remote, and transcendent, symbolizing the throne of divine wisdom. The rigidly frontal poses of the figures, their stern, expressionless faces are painted in the crisp, angular painting style of the Romanesque. As we will see, this treatment of Virgin and Child will change throughout the Middle Ages. Monks convened for meetings in chapter houses similar to this mid-12th century French example from Notre-Dame de Ponto in southwestern France. The chapter house was often rectangular in plan and furnished with stone benches that lined the room. Here, over 800 years ago, Benedictine and Cistercian monks once sat. The Abbey of Ponto suffered both from changing political fortunes and from neglect. It was partially destroyed in 1569 during the Protestant Reformation. By the 19th century, the Ponto chapter house was being used as a stable. On the central columns are rings, once used to tether cattle. The chapter house deteriorated further until it was purchased in the early 1930s. A particularly significant aspect of this structure is its vaulting system, an important departure from the rounded vault popular in the Romanesque period, as we saw in the Fuentidueña apse. Here in the chapter house, it is replaced by two intersecting barrel vaults. The ribs distribute the weight of the ceiling away from the walls to the central columns. Because the exterior walls were no longer a building's sole support, windows could be enlarged. But the builder of this chapter house did not entirely trust this new type of vaulting. The thick walls characteristic of the Romanesque have been retained for additional support. With the ability to enlarge the window came a natural inclination to decorate it. Elaborate window tracery and stained glass were artistic innovations of the era we now refer to as the Gothic, dating from approximately 1150 to 1500. The pointed arch is the element that made the high ceilings of Gothic buildings possible, and ribbed vaults, supported by buttresses on the exterior, permitted the so-called Gothic cage of stone, whose wide, lofty openings were ideal spaces for glowing compositions of glass. Abbot Suger of the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis outside of Paris described a new addition to the abbey's church as shining, and I quote him, with the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows pervading the church's interior beauty. The Gothic period is characterized by an increasingly warm, human quality reflected in the rise of popularity of the Virgin Mary, who interceded between man and his God. In this 14th century Virgin and Child, Mary is portrayed in an attitude strikingly different from the fresco painting we saw in the Fuentidueña apse. Here, she is an elegant court lady, young, regal, and serene. Her posture swings in a graceful S-curve, carefully balancing the Christ child, now represented as a chubby-cheeked, playful infant, far different from the stern man-child of Romanesque interpretation. In honor of the Cloisters' 50th anniversary in 1988, the Treasury was reinstalled. It houses many objects rich in diversity, great rarity, and extraordinary beauty, such as this English ivory Virgin of the late 13th century. A treasury is simply a secure place in which to house objects of great value. In ancient times, cult images and liturgical implements wrought in gold, silver, and other precious metals were placed in temples and sanctuaries for safekeeping. By the Middle Ages, almost every cathedral and abbey church, however small, had some form of treasury. The treasury is filled with masterworks created as acts of faith to be used during the celebration of the Lord's service. The painting, Scenes from the Life of St. Augustine, shows a variety of ecclesiastical objects, like those displayed in the treasury, in practical use. Splendid Gothic illuminated manuscripts were created for the private devotions of the nobility. This luminous Book of Hours contains prayers to be said at each devotional hour of the day observed in monastic life. It was commissioned in 1413 by Jean, Duc de Berry, brother of King Charles V of France. The artists were the brothers Limbourg, miniaturists who were brought to France from the Netherlands. Painted in tempera and gold, the illustrations are elegant, courtly, and almost ethereal in style. The term illuminated manuscript might have been coined for this book, which shimmers with light and color. this tiny palm-sized book of ours, created for the Queen of France, Jeanne d'Evreux, wife of Charles IV, was painted by the Gothic master Jean Pucelle. The book measures only 3.5 by 3 inches and would have fit quite comfortably in the Queen's hands. Whether produced for clerics or princes, much of the art of the Middle Ages expressed man's preoccupation with both the spiritual and earthly realms in his search for salvation. Here in the Treasury are secular objects as well. A French 13th century jeweled salt cellar made of rock crystal and gold. A German double cup bearing a coat of arms composed of 3 upended conical hats. An enameled beaker decorated with the mischievous antics of a band of apes who rob a sleeping peddler. A ceremonial ewer topped by the figure of a mythical wild man who symbolizes the might of its owner. A sparkling silver-gilt brooch in the shape of the letter E, which bears the inscription, "Fair lady, may I always remain close to your heart." A set of playing cards, whose 4 suits depict elements of the hunt, one of the earliest full deck of cards to have survived to the present day. All of these secular objects, and the religious ones as well, were commissioned by individual patrons. One patron commemorated his family in this elaborate tomb ensemble. It was probably commissioned in the early 14th century for the necropolis of a family at a monastery in northern Spain. The effigies of the Count of Urgel and his wife, Cecilia of Foix, are installed one above the other in a double tomb. Great detail was lavished upon these stone sculptures, such as the elaborately embroidered and tasseled cushion which supports the head of the Count, and the richly ornamented cap worn by Cecilia. Yet, as specific as these tomb sculptures might be, they were not intended as portraits, but as commemorations. The high Gothic effigy of the Crusader knight Jean d'Alluy is an eloquent example of an idealized funerary monument. His effigy embodies the knightly qualities of strength and courage, symbolized by the lion crouched at the knight's feet. He is represented as a young man, armed in mail with his sword and shield, his hands joined in prayer and his eyes open. Jean d'Alluy joined a crusade to the Holy Land in 1240, returning to France with a relic of the True Cross. After his death a few years later, this effigy was installed in the abbey he had founded near Le Mans in northern France. This room contains an extraordinary set of tapestries woven in Brussels in about 1500. It depicts the quest for the mythical unicorn. The images display the medieval desire for interpreting in history and nature a vast interlocking network of symbols. While the tapestries may be read as the popular tale of the hunt for the elusive magical unicorn, they can also be explained as a tale of courtly love, representing the search and eventual capture of the lover bridegroom by his adored lady. And there is the Christian interpretation as well, a symbolic retelling of Christ's suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection. Even the patrons of the unicorn tapestries, who remain unknown, are symbolized by the artfully camouflaged letter A and E reversed. The Lord of the Hunt and his companions set forth on their quest for the unicorn. On leash are greyhounds, who chase by sight, and running hounds who chase by scent. One of the party calls in the distance that the quarry has been sighted. The hunters gather around a fountain. They watch the milk-white unicorn dip his purifying horn in a poisoned stream. Waiting to drink the water in safety are creatures whose natures were praised by medieval writers. The noble and valiant lion who sleeps with his eyes open. The stag, a destroyer of dangerous serpents, sets lessons for Christians in the ways he protects his kind against the hazards of life. The hunt continues in earnest. Dogs are unleashed and spears are thrust. but the unicorn nimbly leaps the stream and eludes the hunters. The unicorn fights back. He gores a dog with his horn and kicks out at a huntsman with his hooves. He cannot be taken by ordinary means. However, he can be taken by cunning. The unicorn comes eagerly to the lap of the maid, whose delicate hand rests on his mane. Medieval authorities agreed on the essentials of this episode. As the unicorn surrendered his fierceness and became vulnerable through his encounter with the maid, so Christ surrendered his divine nature and became human through the Virgin Mary. The roses blooming in the garden of this tapestry are symbolic of Mary, the white ones of her virginity, the red ones of her charity and compassion. Planted in this cloister is a garden that has no equivalent in medieval horticulture. The unique garden consists of about 50 species of plants depicted in the unicorn tapestries. Contrary to the laws of nature, all the plants depicted in the tapestries bloom at the same time. The unicorn is slain. He is carried on the back of a horse to the lord and lady of the castle, who will benefit by possession of his magic horn, which was believed to have the powers of purification. In the final tapestry, the unicorn lives again. In this case, he represents both the risen Christ and the captured bridegroom. The imagery suggests that the tapestries were designed to celebrate a marriage, and many of the details reinforce this impression. What appears to be blood on the unicorn's body is pomegranate juice dripping from the tree above. The fruit symbolizes the church, Christ, and the promise of immortality. It also makes reference to an abundance of children. Even the tiny frog was reputed to have an aphrodisiac bone in its left side. Unlike the unicorn tapestries, the identity of the patron in Robert Campin's Annunciation altarpiece, painted around 1425, is clearly known. He is the merchant Engelbrecht of Mechelen, shown with his wife. The earlier mode of identifying patrons only by their initials or coat of arms has been replaced by actual portraits as large as the main figures and taking an active part in the drama. The triptych's central panel illustrates the Archangel Gabriel's announcement to the Virgin that she has been chosen to be the mother of the Son of God. Joseph is depicted in his workshop on the right wing. This is one of the greatest examples of early Flemish painting. For the painting, Robert Campin used the innovative technique of oil paint on wood panel. Campin represents a Flemish townscape and a middle-class interior with ordinary objects that also serve the symbolic needs of his story. The brass basin and the lily signify Mary's purity. The rays of sun entering the window give visual form to the allegory of Mary's perpetual virginity, for it was believed that just as sunshine could pass through glass without damaging it, so was the Virgin's womb filled with the Holy Spirit while leaving her virtue untouched. Even the mousetrap in Joseph's workshop is a reference to salvation. St. Augustine explained, "The cross of the Lord was a mousetrap for the devil. The bait by which he would be caught was the Lord's death." In addition to his meticulous rendering of objects, there is a solidity and sureness of form that is truly astounding. Campin created a remarkable composition in seductive space, rich pattern, translucent color, and delicate gradations of light. The depiction of Mary is a departure from the medieval representations we have seen. She is a real woman, dressed in a simple though elaborately painted robe in a domestic interior. With great humility, Mary is seated on the floor, reading. She has come down to us from her throne in the 12th century fresco in the Fuentidueña apse and entered everyday life. I hope you have enjoyed our brief tour. Many more extraordinary works of art can be seen at the Cloisters. I encourage you to undertake your own personal exploration of the collection. A visit to the Cloisters, as you've seen, affords a unique experience of the medieval world in modern-day New York.